Okay, so we're recording. And we're sitting here with Denis Rancourt, Dr. Denis Rancourt, who was a professor of physics at the University of Ottawa, and now is an independent researcher with the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. Um, we're really happy to sit with you today, Denis. Been looking forward to speaking to you. I've read so much of your work.
I'm happy to be here with both of you, Layla, Alexander. It's great. It's great to be in this on this format, and I'm ready for your questions.
Yeah, so as I was just saying before we jumped in, um, you're kind of, well, maybe not that rare as you were saying, but it is unusual to meet people who are both critical of climate change, of the climate change narrative, and critical of COVID-19, both of which you are, and you've been for a long time. And so that's why we wanted to speak to you, because it's analysis that Alex and I have been developing as well, looking at the scientific truths behind these two things and how they interlink with the ongoing politics of the day, which you've already written about too. I have yet to read this paper, unfortunately, but I did want to point everyone to a very long paper you've written back in 2019 called Geopolitics. Oh, sorry. It's called Geoeconomics and Geopolitics Drive Successive Eras of Predatory Globalization and Social Engineering, Historical Emergence of Climate Change, Gender Equity, and Anti-Racism as State Doctrines. Sounds great. I really wish I'd had the chance to read this before, but for anyone who wants to read it, you can go to Denis Rancourt's website. We'll link to it if you're listening to this over the podcast in the show notes. And you also have all your COVID-19 and other climate change research. But anyways,
Yeah, the URL is very simple. It's denisrancourt, one word, .ca.
exactly. Yes. Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for all your work. Okay. So I wanted to ask you as a first question. Um, and I think a lot of people maybe who I would say I'm more on the very skeptical side of all this stuff. But even people who are just a little bit skeptical have been surprised by the broad agreements with all of these doxas with regards to climate change, with regards to COVID-19 and the pandemic management. Um, so I was hoping you could maybe speak to, as someone who was a professor for many years teaching university aged people, why do you think there is such a lack of critical thinking in our society, especially in Canadian
Oh
society?
my. Oh my. Okay, well, I'll try to put it in a nutshell. I actually wrote a paper about this long ago that's in maybe the education section of my website, which explains how the educational system was transformed towards a more totalitarian entity. And all the transformations that I saw throughout my career and throughout being a student for the last many decades. So there's definitely been a huge transformation of the educational system in Canada and in Ontario in particular since the 50s and 60s. What the way I understand all of this is that after a major conflict like the Second World War, there is a period of growth and reorganization of the society, and there's also associated with that period, at least in the democratic societies, there's a lot more freedom. And the democratic societies, the United States in particular, understood that the best way to encourage growth in order to really surpass and compete with the Russian system is to allow freedom, economic freedom, uh, democratic freedom, to have a layered decision-making process and a layered economic process, and that this encourages creativity, self-motivation, and so on. They understood that, and they operated that way under Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was signed just before the Second World War ended. And the Bretton Woods Agreement was a way to encourage all of the satellites, allies, if you like, to develop economically in a really positive way using these kinds of methods. And it was extremely successful. So there was tremendous economic growth in, for example, Japan and Europe and so on, to the point that it was going to surpass the United States. And the United States saw the opportunity to unilaterally dissolve the Bretton Woods Agreement and, in its place, put in the US dollar as the world currency. And this put a stop to this wonderful growth that the Allies were experiencing, and was the first burst of what I would call US centered globalization. And so you can see a lot of indicators, and I write about that in my papers, just shoot up in terms of globalization, aggressive takeovers, a more aggressive exploitation of the developing world, and so on. And so the U.S. Took its place as the boss, if you like, of the world currency, which means it controlled everything. It could print all the money it wanted. It could have a huge military without limit, and so on. And it could use that currency to exploit other continents. And um, we have to understand that the Bretton Woods period was a period of this incredible freedom and growth of institutions. That's when the freedom of speech movements in universities developed. That's when there were democratic processes within even universities, like student representatives on all the various committees. All these things that we took for granted were actually fought for during that period of kind of freedom. And then the establishment felt that, and this is documented historically, that democracy was becoming a threat for them, and was a nuisance, and they started to ratchet back. And so there was a progressive turning away from democracy and towards more control, and dumbing down and killing this freedom, if you like. So starting in the 1980s, you could really see a turn. And then something else happened, which was really major geopolitically, which is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And that happened in the early 90s. And this was the turning point for a second phase of really aggressive US centered globalization. So you can see mega mergers, you can see takeovers of European companies, you can see all very aggressive financial system being put into place. And so that was massive as well. And so the globalization, this kind of globalization, has tended to be accompanied with a move towards less democracy and more totalitarian kind of controls and surveillance and so on. And you can follow that. And just at the point where the Soviet Union dissolved, the US saw that there was no longer any ideological or structural or military barrier to their complete dominance. And they really took advantage of that. And at the same time, they developed new ideologies for the Western world. And these were put into place they were initiated and introduced through the United Nations in a series of international conferences. One of them was environmental. It was the World Summit on the environment in Rio de Janeiro, and that introduced the environment as kind of an ideology, a kind of a religious ideology. In other words, you detach it, it was a way of detaching real problems in real communities, in real countries, and so on, and make it a theoretical thing regarding the environment, species, CO2, pollution. These are very sanitized problems that where you take away the connection of people and their development to the environment, and so on. So they developed the environment as one of these ideological issues, and they also developed two other important ones. And so the environment included the idea of global warming, and then that was pushed and exploited further in various different ways. And the other two ideologies, one was um, and this is going to sound strange, but gender equity. So instead of human rights in the traditional sense, where you fought against child child soldiers being exploited in wars, and extreme poverty affecting children, and so on, instead it became focused on the female child, and on gender equity in terms of having equal numbers of female politicians, and in all the committees, and in all layers of government, and in all the corporations. So this was introduced as an ideology, and you can really see the numbers of women in government and in these positions just skyrocket from that point on, from the point that the ideology was introduced. And the idea was that that was going to fundamentally change, make it a more fair world. I think it was. I think it's clear that it's more fair for women in those positions, but it's not at all clear that the structures and that the exploitation, the mechanism of exploitation were changed. Not at all. But anyway, that was another ideology. And so you had global warming, gender equity, and that's the time. That's at the same time you went from women's studies in universities to gender studies. So the nomenclature was changed, the focus was changed, and this trickled down to all our institutions. And the other big one was what was it? I'm forgetting now. But there was the climate, there was gender equity. Oh yes, the other big one, the other ideology that was introduced at that time in the early 1990s was anti-racism. So anti-racism became something theoretical. Like racism was this theoretical concept. A lot, like violence is a theoretical concept, right? You eliminate violence as though it were a substance in the ether, and racism became that kind of thing. So the United Nations and its committees went from actually addressing systemic racism in countries, on in the field, on the ground, and continental differences in treatment and in economic organization. They went away from that towards racism as a concept that you fought, as this thing in the ether, and they attacked specifically the language of racism, and they promoted this idea that if you change the language, you would change the racism itself. And so that was introduced in the early 90s with these international conferences, and I do the history of that in my paper. And so these ideologies became the framework of the Western religion, if you like, of the Western narratives that really occupied the minds of the manager class, the managerial class, the upper middle class, the professional class in the Western world that was going to manage this even more aggressive globalization. And so you can follow all of that, and you can see how it works. So it's really about geopolitics and the design of our institutions. So what I'm trying to say is we went from a situation where there was a lot of freedom in the institutions, in society, economically, and so on, and we moved towards a more totalitarian system with these imposed ideologies, or these introduced ideologies that were tested to see how useful they would be. So I don't know. I don't even remember what your question was, but I think I was answering it. But that's the big picture as I see it. What was your question again? Let's make sure that we answered
I know.
it.
It was just if you could give your thoughts as to why you think there's so a little critical thinking in today's
Right,
educated, young population and older and so.
right. So as part of that process towards totalitarianism, the educational system was gutted and was transformed. For example, in Ontario, that they removed grade 13.
Mhm.
They removed preparation time for all teachers. They said, we're only going to pay you for class time. That's what matters, is the contact time. So teachers went from being professionals who could think and design and have a big say in the curriculum to just automatons that deliver a government given curriculum and
Mm.
that have no time for preparation. No time for preparation. So no more discussions in class. No more of the things that I was used to as a high school student. They were removed, and it was all streamlined towards just delivering a curriculum and putting you in the university where you deliver more curriculum. And as a university professor, I actually saw this myself. I actually saw this break in what the students were like. The last cohort that had grade 13 and the first cohort that didn't have it, and how they had been treated for their 4 years at high school, just made an entirely different species of students. They were much less independent, much less critical, and we went from a situation where the students would argue with me at the first classes of a course what the curriculum would be and why it was important, and we'd have these wonderful discussions, to a situation where the students were asking me, can you assign more work?
Mm.
We want to practice this better and more, and I was like, wow, I've never seen this before. Could you assign extra work? There's already lots of homework and everything. So you could really see that there were structural changes, and The way I understand this is that, and I've written about this, social animals, including humans, organize themselves in dominance hierarchies. This is just a fact. Animal studies have shown this conclusively, and if you look at history of human societies, you're always in a dominance hierarchy. That's the organizational principle, and this principle is understood scientifically. And these dominance hierarchies evolve in time. There's a lot of interactions going on, and there's some recent work in by theoretical physicists, in fact, that show that a dominance hierarchy in a human society will evolve towards a totalitarian system, very gradually evolve towards a totalitarian system, and what the parameters are that control that, and therefore that at certain times you need to ratchet it back, but that the general tendency is a very slow kind of divergence towards a much more hierarchical system where you have just a few people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom of the pyramid, if you like. And so I've studied that theory, and I understand it, and I think that it's one of the great advances in social science that physicists have made just recently. I'm in touch with one of the authors of that paper, and so that colors my analysis of society and how this is happening and why it's happening. And I don't know if we're going to go there, but I could explain what the control parameters are regarding this shift. Like, are you going to be in a steady democratic like society with more stratification? Are you going to be stable there for a long time, or is eventually are you going to have this runoff towards totalitarianism? Um, and so there's two parameters that control that in society, I believe. One is how violent the society is, and by that I mean when you break the rules, when you do something that the majority don't like, how violently are you punished? How big is the fine? How do you go to prison? How long do you stay in prison? Are you tortured, and so on? So what is the violence of the system, if you like? That's one parameter that you can quantify, and the other parameter is how authoritative or totalitarian is the society. And what that means is when you have conflicting elements of the society, will the institution or element that has more societal status, more power, will they always win, or is there some probability that sometimes you'll win some of those fights? So if the probability that sometimes you'll win some of those battles in court or wherever is very small, then you're moving towards totalitarianism. And what they showed in their brilliant theoretical model was that if you have a very authoritarian and a very violent society, you very quickly evolve towards a structure that is totalitarian. And if you can bring those parameters back, you can find a domain in the phase space, if you like, where the society is stable in a democratic and stratified state for a long time.
Mm.
And they looked at the kinetics of that, how long does it take, and so on. And so there's some really interesting theoretical work that I think goes beyond the classical theories of capitalism, socialism, all these other, these classical theories, because it starts from the biological reality that we necessarily occupy a dominance hierarchy. Now, the dominance hierarchy is um, is stabilized in the evolutionary sense by health. This is the connection to COVID. This is fascinating. So, what I have explained in my writings is that scientists have found that the first determining factor of an individual's health and how long they're going to live and how sick they're going to be and how often they're going to be sick is the chronic stress that they're subjected to by being put in their place in the dominance hierarchy.
Mm.
That's it. And they've studied monkeys and all kinds of animals, and they've taken blood samples at various times during these interactions, and they have shown that the immune system is directly affected by this stress, and that is why these individuals are sicker and are more sick when they get sick and die sooner, and is because there is an intimate physiological tie between the immune system, which is well known now. The medical researchers know this really, really well. Between the immune system, its vitality and its ability to fight infection and so on, including cancer and including all these all infections, um, um, and the hierarchical stress that you're subjected to and that you experience as an individual. So science now knows these are like some of the big discoveries of medicine of the last decades, is that there is a very strong and intimate tie between chronic stress and social isolation also, and your health through the immune system. And so I have argued in my work that because of this tie that's very real, this tie actually stabilizes a dominance hierarchy, because it ensures that the individuals that are low in the class structure are actually weaker and don't have the resources and the energy to fight back, if you like, or to do anything but take their place and take orders. And so I see that there's a mechanism, a fundamental mechanism in any dominance hierarchy. Health of individuals plays a role intimately. And so I see the medical establishment as the institutional expression of that. And so the role of medicine, if you like, and pharma in this theoretical perspective is to keep you sick, is to make sure that it emphasizes or amplifies that people are going to be dependent on pharma, dependent on the medical establishment, and are going to be made sick by medicine itself. And we know it's well established that medicine in the Western world is the third leading cause of death. There's no question about that. There are entire scientific journals devoted to this. There are international conferences about it. And the argument is, will it become the second leading cause of death? And the leading causes of death traditionally are cancer and heart disease, which are two ailments, chronic heart disease. So those are two ailments that medicine basically isn't able to do anything about, irrespective of the propaganda that they tell you. I mean, chemotherapy, the poisons they inject are not very helpful at all in terms of helping you with cancer and so on. So the randomized control trials in that regard are just statistically insignificant, bogus research, a lot of bad research there. So I see the so that's the connection I would make to COVID
Mm.
from a theoretical point of view. From a theoretical point of view.
Ye-
So I'm giving you broader answers than maybe what you wanted, but yeah.
No, it's great. We can branch off to a whole variety of topics that we want to ask you about with this. I guess this is a bit a different approach that Alex and I take in some ways. I think maybe Alex can speak to this. Like we tend to see this whole situation through the lens of bureaucracy, that which are necessary for the running of capitalism, of this stage of capitalism, given its huge monopolies and its need for a bloated state. But I think that though we come maybe from a different theoretical background, I'm hearing a lot of similarities in that I do very much agree that this forces people into a hierarchical arrangement, which in which they don't have any venues of input really or resistance, or like for instance, like when we're asked to do some random protocol for COVID-19, we have no way of dissenting. I have no way of giving my input and saying and asking questions as to why, asking for the evidence. Like there's no method through which we can do that. And so it very much is oppressive. And um,
Oh, it's an extremely oppressive system.
yes,
It's incredible. And yeah, no, we're being subjected to extreme oppression here in these in this COVID crisis. But it's been that way for a long time. We just
yes.
didn't
Yeah.
notice. We just didn't notice. Yeah.
Well, I think when I think about it, I think it's because for a lot of folks who tend to create the media, who tend to generate intellectual work, they're professionals like you and I. typically in office jobs, right? And so the employer in that circumstance doesn't have, you are under a situation of control and it has its own challenges in a variety of levels, but it's not as tightly controlled and tightly supervised as, say, someone working on the factory floor. So for a lot of working class jobs. And so I just think that the,
I'm not. I want to interject and disagree.
mhm,
I want to explain why I'm disagreeing with that. What sounds like an obvious point, and that is that professional workers are much more highly indoctrinated than manual workers.
yes,
The system of indoctrination is lengthy, elaborate, and extremely effective. So, and it is demoralizing morally for some professional workers to be indoctrinated to this degree. And the system of indoctrination has been brilliantly explained in a book called Disciplined Minds that was written by Jeff Schmidt. It's an extraordinary system, and Jeff Schmidt in his book he explains that how to survive that indoctrination with your principles intact, your personality intact, and the way that he explains how to survive it, he applies a U.S. military manual of how to survive being a prisoner of war, and he maps it onto the professional school and the professional environment to try to suggest how you might survive this. It's quite an important book, but what I have found throughout my life is the extreme degree of indoctrination of even the highest level intellectuals, university professors who are supposed to train others. The level of alignment of thought and of just impossibility of even imagining that you could oppose something that is staggering. So there's a lot less freedom in the professional environments, in my opinion, than truck drivers and the people in the salaried workers that are not professional workers have more freedom of thought as well. I mean, they know that they're just doing this because they have to, in quotations, and that this is silly and crazy. It's just another thing that the boss is imposing, like he often does. But the professionals will actually believe this stuff.
yeah,
They'll actually believe it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's because of the fact that they are more autonomous in their work vis-a-vis working jobs where, the foreman is always on your case, working you harder and harder, that they do need this extra level of indoctrination. So I think these two things work very closely with one another. And so it's just to say that I think that the kind
I agree. I agree. I was being difficult, but I totally agree with you. Yes.
no, it's it. I think that when this pandemic happened, like for me, for instance, like I never I was a Marxist beforehand, so had been studying and reading about the stuff for years, but I guess I never really had a situation where my civil liberties and rights were so infringed upon, and where I
Mhm.
felt so much irrational. Like I felt like the impositions from society and everyone else were so irrational, and it never really happened to me because I was in jobs I could spend half my day whatever browsing the web, reading the news, and you don't really notice all that much, but then when the situation becomes more blatant, as it did during this pandemic, it you know I think there's still a lot of indoctrination, obviously, because most people have been broadly fine with it, or at least in terms of them speaking out about it, they haven't as much. But like I think for a lot of people, it kind of pushed them over the edge a little. A lot of professionals, at least, I think it pushed them over the edge. But I think another.
Well,
Mhm.
it's funny because some of the professionals that were pushed over the edge, you had to actually coerce them to let the government inject something into their bodies before they got to the point where they said, no, I'm really not comfortable with this. No, I'm opposing this. You're going too far. You had to get to that point to have a small percentage of professionals actually oppose this, and it's because you're standing beside them with a needle and you're going to put something into their arm, and they're able to read, about adverse effects and all these things, and so they're thinking, maybe I don't want that. I'm being unkind to professionals, but I think they deserve it. The professional class did not wake up until they started to realize that they were going to be injected.
Yeah. Well,
Well, because they're used to just doing these things to other people. I mean, that's the for the reason you were mentioning that the most professionals have a degree of autonomy in their work, and certainly I used to work in the British Civil Service, which is where if you keep your head down and obey management directives, they'll generally leave you alone as long as you're doing what they tell you to do. And a lot of the British Civil Service is dedicated towards screwing over the working class in various different creative ways. And one particular example that turned me on to some of the things you were talking about, Denis, a moment ago, was the way that they've treated people who are on the welfare system for a very long time, which was really specifically during the 2000s, during the Blair era, because of course unemployment in our country had been used against the trade unions under Thatcher to keep a large pool of the unemployed as a tool to be used against the working class population. But then we get into the 90s, and the ruling class decide, right, now we need these people to be disciplined. And so, if you want to apply for unemployment, there's 20 different stipulations you have to meet, right down to, in some US states, it was right down to, we're not even going to give you money. We're going to give you a card that you can only use in certain stores. And so, all of that mechanism to essentially discipline and, to be crude about it, fuck with a large section of the population, that was already there. That was already in the governmental machine. I think for most professionals, they never imagined that something like that would happen to them. That was something that was only going to be done to the unacceptable bits of society, the long-term unemployed, the lower end of the working class, and then suddenly it was applied society-wide. So a few more of them woke up, but the concern for me and Layla when we started doing this show was just how many of the medical profession almost seemed like 90% on board with it. The education profession seemed almost entirely on board with it. Certainly, the governmental bureaucracies were all in, but not just like in a sort of opportunist way. They were fundamentalist about it. Many
Yes.
of them really, really embraced it in a way that was and remains quite disturbing, almost like cult-like. So I
Hmm.
wondered if you could speak a little more to that, like why the professional classes like medicine, education, science are so utterly rotten. You've already specified like some of the reasons why, but I wondered if you could go a little more into it as to why they embrace this in such a almost with a fervor of religiosity.
Well, they've been aggressively dumbed down for decades. Going through medical school these days is not being exposed to brilliant researchers and medical doctors that will tell you about their thinking and their analysis, and it's not like that at all. It has become learning what the protocols are because you're going to be applying them, and these protocols are going to be changing all the time, and your duty is to apply them because you will not be acting ethically as a professional if you do not follow these rules, and you can be disciplined and so on. So the MDs have no time to think about what does this mean, what is the underlying science, to discuss whether it's valid or not. Because they're too busy learning the narratives of all these protocols and what they're going to be telling their patients, and how they're going to be selling these treatments and these protocols, and they're so busy learning that by rote and without thinking and without applying. Like we've gone completely from the medical doctor as scientist observing in the field what works and what doesn't, and how he or she can be with their patients, and writing papers on that basis that get sent to the medical journals and so on. We've gone from that ideal kind of system that develops under freedom to one that is uh, uh, automatons that are given social status and a high salary, but they're going to be performing these tasks, and they will be punished for thinking critically. And they're punished because it's a waste of their resources. It's a waste of it's not going to go anywhere. So it's necessarily a punishment to take time to try to figure out what's really going on and so on. So they're learning these narratives and then they're applying them. And the narratives are accompanied by these extremely complex protocols, treatment protocols, and so on, that they have to know in great detail, and that they're responsible to apply. So I think there's, and that has happened in every discipline. In science, in academia, in the hard sciences, the funding went from a free system where you were given research funding, and you, the principal investigator, could decide what to work on and could apply for grants accordingly, and had a lot of freedom in who you were going to hire, what you were going to do. I know, because I entered into that system as a young professor. When I was 29 years old, it was like that, and it was proudly that way. And then over the course of the next decade or two, it became that the funding would be tied to industrial projects, that it would have to have an economic value, that it would have to be, you need partners that say, yeah, this is research we can use. And so it became what they called strategic funding. And more of the funding envelope went from just giving freedom to researchers and letting them decide what's important in society, towards just another payoff for corporations and so on. And it was really structurally and aggressively transformed in that way, so that and at the same time, you can only, the whole peer review system is one that aligns you. It's a corrupt system of secretly having competitors review your work, uh, and then the editor who decides what they're going to show you and makes the ultimate decision is bought out by pharma and other interests in various ways, and the journals themselves have to serve these interests, so that you learn very quickly as a researcher what you can say and what you can't say, what the reviewers will choke on and completely reject and find all kinds of reasons to reject, and how you have to adapt your language to get it through. So they perfect this way of talking where they're trying to communicate the important thing between the lines without saying it. And so it's like this mind thing, and no one from the public's going to understand what this is about, and what you would really like to say but you can't. They can't read a paper that way. I can. I can do that, but most people cannot, and the media certainly cannot. So I've seen that transformation. And so I think we have to understand this as a huge transformation of all the institutions and all the professions that has operated over many decades, and that is driven at the highest levels by geopolitical interests. This is because of what's going on in the geopolitical world. I was talking about these eras of globalization and more aggressive globalization and economic takeovers and everything. And in fact, I would bring that all the way to COVID. I have explained and argued in my interviews that I think we lost Layla, um, but should what
Right.
I think she'll pop back.
Well, she's the one that's doing the recording. So, do you mind if we just pause for a moment? I'll just see
Sure,
what's happened to her connection.
sure.
Uh,
Sorry about that.
okay.
I dropped out. Can you guys hear
Okay.
me?
We were worried that the recording was interrupted.
It was not interrupted. No.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
okay.
Sorry about that.
So I was explaining that in my recent interviews, I've been laying out that COVID, in fact, is a war measures. They are war measures. And I've explained what the war is and how these COVID measures are, in fact, war measures. So they're intended, well, first of all, the war is the very hot economic war between China and the US centered global world, and China and its influence and so on. So that economic war is very real. There's a complete reorganization of the manufacturing base away from China and towards satellites in Asia that are controlled by the U.S. There's reinvestment, deinvestment. Supply routes are being completely transformed, and there's military circling of China as well. That's very active and very real. And at the same time, Russia's being pressured by NATO, and they're trying to move into Ukraine and so on. So Eurasia was developing at a good pace and was on a trajectory to surpass. We were entering a multipolar world, and the U.S., the main instrument of the U.S. dollar, the currency that they control, was being used with sanctions and so on to harm the development of these competitors. And so the competitors found ways to circumvent the U.S. dollar by doing bilateral agreements in their own currencies. And there were more and more of these bilateral agreements. So it was unstoppable. Eurasia will develop and is developing, and but the U.S. has decided to aggressively try to harm it as much as possible, and so this is the era that we've entered into. Trump tried to negotiate a deal that would have been to the great disadvantage of China, and China said no, and as a result, now they're implementing this punishment and this reorganization. Now, a reorganization like that of the entire world economy is going to have big consequences, including for the domestic populations in the US and Canada and Europe and so on. And that includes, one of the big consequences is inflation, because the system was optimized in a sense, had been structured in a way, and everything was running smoothly. And now you're disrupting all of that, so you're necessarily going to get inflation. So we've just had in the US the most inflation since 1982, just broke that record. 7% per year, which is massive. And I think it's going to be higher than that. Inflation is very harmful to regular working people. It takes away their savings, the value of their pensions, and so on. And so it's a huge attack against the domestic populations. And so you're in a war, and there are going to be consequences. And there's going to be backlash. And there's going to be all kinds of things. And in a war, you need war measures. You need a control. You need to ensure that there is no domestic resistance, no domestic terrorism, no domestic uh, democratic criticism of the war effort. You need all the controls. You need complete surveillance. You need to be able to put people away if they're resistors. You need to be able to stop all travel or frustrate travel greatly. And so I understand the COVID measures as war measures that were applied in this war. And so I think that what is driving this is geopolitics. And so those are the ideas I've been developing. And that's the only way that I can understand the COVID measures, because I've been analyzing all-cause mortality in detail. That is resolved by time, by age group, by sex, and also by jurisdiction. And I see no evidence that there was a particularly virulent pathogen that dropped onto Earth that we needed to respond to.
Mm.
What I see instead is everywhere where there are increases in all-cause mortality, significant increases, they're always tied to the measures that were applied. So, for example, when the pandemic was announced on the 11th of March 2020, and the UN said, "Get your hospitals ready, or you're going to have this wave of people who are really sick," and that meant take sick people out of the intensive care units, out of hospital beds, and the elderly people, and put them into homes, and then lock those homes down. That is the opposite of what was scientifically recommended to avoid epidemics in homes. The exact
Mm.
opposite, and it was murderous. And so there was a huge peak in all-cause mortality immediately following that announcement, that you can see in all the jurisdictions that did this. New York is the classic example, but Quebec is the province in Canada that did this most aggressively and had management problems also in their care homes. And so there was this killing period of about 2 or 3 months, and then the all-cause mortality came down after they had killed these most vulnerable people. And in that age group above 80, mortality actually goes below the historic trend after that huge peak. And that's because you accelerated their deaths in that peak, and then you come down below. In Canada, I'm talking about. So we understand this phenomenon. And every peak in the all-cause mortality that you can measure and see and quantify, and I've done this in detail, state by state in the United States, province by province in Canada, many European countries. You can understand in terms of the measures that were applied, the lockdowns and so on.
Mm.
And so in the United States, for example, there were 1 million extra deaths above the historic trend in the COVID crisis period. And these deaths occurred primarily, there's a very strong correlation with poverty and obesity, and it occurred in those states. And the correlation is so strong that if you reduce those parameters enough, you get no extra deaths. And in Canada, there was no net excess mortality, statistically speaking. So here you have this narrative of an incredibly dangerous, virulent, that transmits really widely, pandemic and everything. Yet it didn't cross the border into Canada. You have 1 million extra deaths in the U.S. and nothing measurable in Canada. You see the point? So this is completely scientifically impossible. Viruses don't stop at jurisdictional borders. There were 30 states in the United States that didn't have that first peak, that didn't aggressively attack the elderly in that way. 30 that didn't show the peak statistically at all. So it is, whereas we understand seasonal epidemics in the sense that they are always very regular. There's a winter high in the northern mid-latitude countries, and there's a summer trough. It's extremely regular. It's in Europe, it's in North America, etc. It's reversed in the southern hemisphere, mid latitudes, because our winter is their summer and so on. So they get it in their winter, and this is all really well studied and has been known for 100 years. And there's a lot of understanding of that process, and that's how viral respiratory diseases operate. They do not stop at borders. They do not. Doesn't matter. And you can go back 100 years and you see this. So um, what I observed in all-cause mortality studies is incompatible with the idea of a viral respiratory disease, and in particular, a special and virulent one, because a pandemic was scientifically argued that it would cause 5 to 50 times more deaths than usual from the respiratory agents. And you would clearly see this, and we don't see it in Canada whatsoever, statistically speaking. So, and I could go on like that. So I have concluded that there was no pandemic in terms of a virulent special pathogen. There was just all the usual viral respiratory diseases, all the usual bacteria that infect us. In the United States, we showed that the killer mechanism was bacterial infections. There was almost always a bacterial infection associated to what they called COVID. And this, the CDC has lots of statistics on this, and we analyzed that. And at the same time, they stopped prescribing antibiotics. So antibiotic prescriptions dropped by half in the United States, where there was an epidemic of pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, that went up tenfold. And so this was the mechanism, the health mechanism, that killed these people in the states where there's a lot of poverty and obesity. And we believe that they were more vulnerable to bacterial infection because of the extraordinary stress of the lockdown measures and all the destruction of the social networks, of the informal working networks, and so on. This was all destroyed, and all ages were affected. So we looked at the death percent increase of mortality by age group. And unlike a viral respiratory diseases, the young adults, even children, were affected. So, for example, in the age group, I think it was 12 to 44 years old, there's an increase in mortality for that age group of more than 40%
Yeah.
in the COVID crisis period, and so on. So this is not a viral respiratory disease. The only time you see flu and viral respiratory diseases, they only kill the elderly, generally speaking. And so the last time this happened was 1918 in the so-called Spanish flu, which is known scientifically. There have been excellent scientific articles written looking at the microscope slides of the lungs of many of these patients. They all had bacterial infections. And this was at a period before antibiotics were invented. That's why the young were killed during that epidemic. And so our conclusion is that the United States recreated the conditions of 1918 by not prescribing antibiotics, by producing stress like structural changes in the society that were like just coming out of a war and the harsh industrial era of the time in 1918. They recreated those conditions and killed 1 million people in the United States,
Did he?
in addition to the historic trend. So that's my picture of what's going on here.
Yes. I thought your paper was excellent. It was written in a very accessible way too, so people could go and check it out and kind of assess your conclusions for themselves. But I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. But something I am wondering about is
Um,
I completely agree with you that this was obviously it was no worse than a bad flu at worst. Whatever the virus, the COVID-19 as a disease is. But what we've been seeing in multiple countries, including Canada, I believe, is a continuing excess death in younger age groups as well that we hadn't seen prior to in the earlier stages of the pandemic. So in places like forget,
No, 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 no. That's not true. In Canada, we looked at this in detail, and in the United States, the excess death among young people started immediately when the pandemic was announced. There's a stepwise increase, and it stays high during the entire time to the present. So I think where you're going with this is you're trying to see if there's a an effect that can be detected in relation to the vaccination campaign. I'm guessing that's where you want to go with this. And there are effects. There are effects, and we're studying them. But the reality that young people were killed, and this is true in Canada, even though the total all-cause mortality statistically didn't change. Nonetheless, we can see when we do by age group that young adults, especially young males, and especially in Alberta, were devastated by these pandemic conditions. So this has been a constant throughout this COVID crisis, with all this stress, social isolation, destruction of the economy. That it's been a real hardship for young people. Um, but I think where you're going with this now is, can we see an effect from the vaccine campaign? Did I guess your question? Did I guess your mind
well, I
correctly?
don't want to.
I'm sorry if I'm.
No. I don't want to presume a cause. That's what I want to ask you about. But from what I've seen,
Mhm.
there has been an increase in excess deaths in these younger age groups. And you're saying there always was excess death in these at the earlier stages of the pandemic. I won't argue with you there, but it seems like there's an increase now with relation to benchmarks from even last year in multiple countries, including the United States, including places like Netherlands, multiple European countries, and Canada. So, what do
Yes.
you make of that? Just I don't.
Yeah, some people are reporting that, and we've looked at it in detail, and I can confirm from the all-cause mortality data in the United States that there are younger age groups among adults that have a net increase that is very significant, and that's even more than the increase that had already arisen because of the pandemic measures.
Yeah,
So yes, that is true, and it happens after the bulk of the vaccination campaign, and it happens in about the period of the third booster, or the third injection, rather. So, um, it well, one thing I can say for certain is that there was a massive and very rapid vaccination campaign that certainly had no positive effect. So the high mortality in the US stayed high. There's no doubt about that. It didn't help in any way. That we can say with certainty. Now, in addition to that, there are signatures in the all-cause mortality where you have these age groups that are statistically higher in, as you correctly point out, in the later months, um, after the vaccination campaign and as we're giving boosters. So there appears to be evidence that the vaccines themselves could be inducing additional deaths. And there are mechanisms that have been proposed to try to explain that. It's way beyond just the direct deaths that occur that you could see in VARs, for example. It's not direct deaths. You know, you're in there in VARs. You can see deaths that occur 1, 2, and 3 days after vaccination. Most of the deaths occur in a very short time. There's a real peak there in terms of time after vaccination. And the deaths that I'm talking about in all-cause mortality of that are not of that nature. And if there were that magnitude of deaths that were so immediately connected to the injection, there would be an outcry that would be incredible. So it's not an obvious thing. It's a longer term thing where potentially the vaccine has made you more vulnerable to dying from pneumonia.
Mm.
Or to dying from something like that, because I can tell that the main mechanism is still pneumonia. So these extra deaths are correlated with the CDC's counting of pneumonia deaths. And so, um, can the vaccine injections make weaken your immune system in such a way as to make you more susceptible to dying from pneumonia than otherwise? And I just interviewed Stephanie Seneff yesterday, and
Oh.
she argues that yes, absolutely.
Mm.
And I've chatted on Zoom with Dr. Bhakti, and he has argued and written that yes, there is definitely a mechanism of that type, and we have to be concerned about it. And there are going to be epidemics that follow this mass vaccination of diseases that we don't normally see at such a high frequency. So at least two researchers that I have great respect for and who have incredible expertise are arguing that the vaccines can directly impact your immune system and its ability to fight off infections, including bacterial infections of the lungs.
Mm.
Okay, so
Well, yeah, I mean,
that's how I would answer that.
no, I think that's a
That
great
yeah.
answer. It's similar. We spoke to Norman Fenton, who's a statistician based in the UK. And, he's also just saying that the long term effects are to be seen. But, and I think a lot of this stuff is, as you say, speculative. But I
Well,
do.
there's more and more research being done. I mean, this has become a very intense area of research, and even the mainstream researchers are getting involved more and more. There's more and more papers coming out, and there's wonderful independent researchers like Jessica Rose and people like that who are going into VARs and doing all kinds of things. Um, I'm in contact with the executive director of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, Joseph Hickey, and he is doing a thorough analysis of VARs right now, and he sees very clearly that there is a direct effect that is in appearance causal all the way out to 50 days after vaccination. So he sees two different exponential drop-offs. The very first drop-off that where the deaths that is applicable 1 week within a week after vaccination, roughly, and then another exponential drop that's linear in a log linear plot that extends out to 50 days. So there's way more to this than the simple pharma narrative that if it's not immediately after vaccination, then you can't say that there's a causal link, etc. No, there's growing evidence that there could be long-term effects, negative effects from these
Mm.
injections, I would say. Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud there when I talked about that most recent unpublished research. Yeah.
Um, Alex, did you want to jump in? Sorry, I don't want to dominate.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, then, shall we move over to questions of the modelling that's been used for this, the whole pandemic period? Recently in the UK, we had a scandal of sorts where the one of the chief modelers that the UK government has used to justify its all of its policies admitted that what they were being asked to provide was worst case scenarios to the scientific advisory group, SAGE, and therefore to the cabinet level. And that this had been done throughout that. And he openly admitted this in an exchange with Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator. So I wondered if you could offer your thoughts, Denis, on modeling that's been used throughout this, and also if you have thoughts on the similarity between like the modeling that's used for COVID and also the notorious climate change modeling as well. So how do you see this playing a role, or am I making a correct comparison there?
Well, no, I mean it's correct in some regards. Look, these people are service intellectuals. They're service scientists. They're serving their bosses. They're serving an agenda, and it is garbage science. I mean, it's pathetic. The modeling is so tenuous. I mean, look, there are seasonal variations in all-cause mortality that we have been studying for about 100 years or more. There's incredible data on it. There's structure, time structure in it. There's age structure in it. There's all kinds of things. There's an enormous amount of data, and these models do not explain it whatsoever. Because, for example, I'll just give you one example. In the data of seasonal mortality, there is no trace. You cannot detect evidence that the causes are transmitted, that they spread geographically. There is no detectable evidence of that. The peaks in all cause mortality occur synchronously around the world in the mid latitude northern hemisphere, for example. And not only that, but within a summer, they have within a winter, I mean, there's a certain structure. And that structure is often very similar in Europe and North America and happening at the same time. So these phenomena are not understood. And sure, as a modeler, you can sit down and say, well, let's pretend that it's about transmission. Let's pretend that there are nuclei of origin and that it transmits from then on. And let's throw in the airplane trips and let's do this and let's do that. And they go off on this modeling exercise that for which there is strong, robust counter evidence that that's not how it operates. No pandemic. There's so much wrong with this whole thing. It's just, I mean, we need another hour. Let me give you another perspective here, okay? I can look at all cause mortality since before 1900, and I can get good data for a big place like the United States or the UK. Has been doing this for a long time. They were the leaders. They invented epidemiology. You've got really good data. Well, now, when you look at that data, you cannot detect any sign that there was a pandemic in any of the modern pandemics after 1918. All this propaganda from the health authorities that when is the next big pandemic. We just had one here. There was one in 2009. Supposedly there was one in 1958, and so on, and they were huge, and we counted deaths, and we wrote papers about it. But when you actually go and look at all cause mortality, what you find is there isn't a trace of these pandemics. What you find instead is that all the extra death events that occur can be explained in terms of societal restructuring and big things that are happening in society, such as the Second World War, such as the economic changes that happen structurally on a large scale. And so I discussed this in our article. At least we start to. Um, these questions, and whether, and you can see it, there's signatures of it, is it the young men that are affected, is it the young women, and so on. And so all of the features that are in all cause mortality that are measurable, that I see in the United States, I've discussed in the introduction to our paper, just to show how you can use this data. So it is a fantasy to be talking about pandemics and to be concerned about pandemics when we know that the politics and the social movements and the restructurings in society and the economic influences are what determine mortality. Mortality was extremely high in the industrial growth period, when you were completely exploiting child workers and workers of all kinds. I mean, mortalities were through the roof in that period, in the Western world that was developing, and then dropped dramatically as health conditions were improved, and sewage systems, healthy living conditions, all these things dramatically removed all these diseases. And it's these kinds of things that matter. Look, the biggest indicator of health of an individual, and I said this at the beginning, I'm going to repeat it, is the stress, the chronic stress that you experience as a result of being oppressed in the dominance hierarchy. There are animal and human studies are unambiguous on this conclusion. Professor Sheldon Cohen spent his whole career in the United States studying viral respiratory diseases, and he showed in his work that that the biggest factors that determine whether you're going to catch it and how sick you're going to be are two things. One is the psychological stress that you're experiencing in your life, and two is the social network that you have and the degree to which you're isolated socially. And he did this work in the 1970s when there was still freedom to do work. And he got volunteers, university students, to agree to be infected with influenza, and did this study. And the results were huge. You didn't have to do a randomized control trial. You didn't have to you weren't looking for a subtle effect in the average. It was huge. It was unambiguous. And what we know now is that elderly people are much more affected physiologically by stress than young people, much more, an order of magnitude more, and that this is a real killer for elderly people. So, I mean, that stress is a determining factor. So when you move a sick elderly person from a hospital bed and put them into a strange environment in a home where everyone is wearing gloves and masks, and you're locking them in and they can't see their family, it's a death sentence. Okay, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Um, so we're talking about this crazy modeling nonsense, and we're avoiding the real discussions about the real determinants of health. And so that's why I say these people are just service intellectuals that are serving an agenda,
Mm.
period. I don't even want to look at, I mean, I understand their models. I can do the modeling myself. But even the models have not been validated. Even when you look at the peak of new cases as a function of time, you do not reproduce it with these simple models. Even if you were to admit that these cases are meaningful, even if you were to admit the lie that you can actually discern a specific virus by these mass testing that they do, the case numbers um, aren't able to quantitatively be explained by the modeling in terms of observed features of the transmission and so on. I mean, just everything is wrong. What can I say? All like the masks have never prevented transmission. Scientists have looked for transmission of viral respiratory disease in the outdoor environment, have looked for it in scientific papers, and they all report that we can't detect anything, that there is no transmission when you're outside. What the hell do you want me to say more than that? I mean, if we're going to follow the science, there's plenty of science. You just have to read it and tabulate it. And instead, We're looking at the press releases of governments talking about these service intellectuals doing just garbage stuff. Okay, that's what we're dealing with. That's the nature of this problem. So I don't know if that's an acceptable answer, but I'm very upset with the level of non-science. These are bought out professionals that are just doing garbage.
No, I'm sure you were quite entertained by the rapid about face by the Public Health Agency of Canada, changing its position from droplet model to aerosolized model when it comes to the transmission of COVID-19, which is something you just talked about in your paper about masking, about why masking doesn't work. But yet they're still insisting that masks work.
Oh, it's
We need a better
obscene.
mask.
It's obscene. Oh, listen, it is so obscene. Listen, I was just talking to a health worker in a hospital in Quebec, and she was telling me what they're now putting them through. They're being forced to wear N95 masks, and they have to find the model that best fits their
Yeah.
face. So there's a whole step of procedures they have to do. They have to get a really tight fit, and then they put them in this plastic bubble and they make them breathe this chemical substance to see if there's any leakage from the mask. Okay, and they actually measure this individually on all the health workers. I mean, this is insane. um, the health workers can't wear an N95 mask that's tightly fitting because you're going to suffocate and get an extreme headache, and it's going to be incredibly uncomfortable. So anyone who's subjected to that is going to be adjusting the mask in order to create some breathing room every once in a while. So this is well known. There's studies that show this. People who are forced to wear these things find ways around it because it's intolerable to do a shift and not be able to breathe.
Yeah.
It gives you incredible headaches, and this is well documented in the scientific papers. So that's the level of insanity that we're going towards. That the smallest wrinkles that you have, and if you have a beard, forget it. You can't put an you're never going to. So okay, so that they need someone. What are they going to give you? Injections to remove your wrinkles next? Are they going to force you to shave? Are they going to glue the mask to your face? Where are they going with this? So now that we're in a crazy world. We're in a crazy world, and this world is one where any place that they weren't aggressive has sufficiently aggressive or didn't have sufficiently fragile populations did not have an excess of mortality.
Yeah. Um,
Okay.
it's quite. Maybe we can finish off the interview with. Well, I mean, just maybe a final thought about the degeneration of science, the degeneration of professionals. Um, so I guess my question is like, so what do you think is the way out of this? Like now, and we're both in Ontario. We're both. Alex has found his way out. He just needed to get his PM embroiled into a scandal.
Yeah, we just needed our prime minister to be visibly drunk on camera, and that was it.
So unfortunately, our PM will likely not do that. Premier of Ontario is now saying he will loosen the restrictions, but I believe the vax passports are still going to be in place. So what I have some ideas about this, but I wanted to get your view. What do you think is the way out of this mess? Like, how can we end this pandemic?
I don't think there's a way out in the sense of the question. I don't think we can end this thing. I think that the geopolitical forces are such that these kinds of measures, the necessity to suppress democracy, have complete surveillance, prevent people from traveling, control movements, install an e-currency, those are long-term projects that are driven by geopolitics, and they're not going away. You have to think in terms of a decade or two,
Hmm.
okay? And the things that will change it most on that large scale are the nature of this economic war, how it will evolve, the ways that Eurasia will find around it, how that competing influence will cause adaptation, and also and the harm to our society is ultimately going to harm the system that wants to dominate. And so it will realize that, and it will ratchet back itself because of that. And so that's the mega view. But down to what can we do, I think we're back to what I was saying at the beginning. We have to resist as individuals. The best thing that the individual can do is to not comply. Do not be injected. Don't refuse to wear a mask, refuse to be injected, refuse all these measures that they're trying to apply. Do not comply as much as you can, as much as you feel is compatible with your personality and your dignity and your human desire to have an influence in society. Don't comply. And the way to not comply is with an eye to where can you be most effective. And where you can be most effective is related to those two parameters I explained at the beginning about what drives us towards totalitarianism. So the degree of violence of the society, how big the punishment is a parameter that drives you towards totalitarianism. So scream like hell when they want to punish you. Complain like crazy when they want to impose fines, or when someone gets violated in a serious way, gets taken away, handcuffed and so on, simply because they're not wearing a mask. Make a big fuss about it. Oppose the violence of the society and oppose the totalitarian, authoritarian nature of the society. So the fact that you never win any battles, you can go to court all you want, you're not going to win any of these cases. All the injunction motions in the Superior Court in Ontario are denied. That's insane.
Yeah.
That's insane. There has to be some merit to some of these legal arguments. So make a big fuss, fight that. Use ridicule, use criticism, use your voice, use your body, do everything you can to oppose this crazy system that wants to be more and more authoritarian, and that is going to be as violent as it believes it needs to be, that it thinks it can win through this kind of violence. And that's why when a barbecue place in southern Ontario decides to open up and everyone's happy about it, they send in a paramilitary force to close it down. They have to kill every spark.
Yeah.
Okay. But what they don't understand is that that's not going to help them. Killing the sparks is not an effective way. It's just like you cannot prevent a forest fire by making sure there's no lightning and making sure that nobody lights a cigarette and making sure, the whole idea of preventing forest fires by preventing the spark or the source is insane, because forest fires, there'll always be a spark. Forest fires are caused by the accumulation of a dry fuel in the underbrush and conditions of drought. If you combine those two things, there's going to be a mega forest fire. There always has been in nature. There always will be. I've written papers about this. It's not about preventing the sparks. They think they can extinguish all the sparks, but what they're doing is they're creating a drought-like atmosphere. They're creating more and more oppression. They're creating more and more discontent people. And eventually there will be fires, and then they'll have to readjust.
Yeah, I think I
That would
brought.
be one theoretical way of looking at it.
Well, I think you're correct in that. I think a lot of these things happen because people just comply to them. Like even in the letter of the law, for instance, masking, when you read the law about it, it's optional. Like no one can force you to wear a mask. Like it's, and so yeah, I just think there's a lot of different themes here, but yeah, I think broadly speak in terms of individual level stuff, I think people need to assert their rights and they to insert their liberties. Like those things were not easy to get. And demand that the government, if they are to infringe upon these things, provide justification, which no government in this country has done for any of these protocols. Where is the risk benefit analysis for the lockdowns, for the vaccines? Nowhere to be found. Anyways,
Yeah, that's an argument one can make, but I agree with you so much that the most powerful, where you have the greatest power is control over your own body and your ability to not comply. That's where you have the most strength. That's where you can, there, if without individuals that refuse to comply, there is no movement. that is the atomic ground level that you need. You need individuals that do not comply, that completely refuse this, that do not want to, that do not want this. They have to be sure of what their position is. So you need these firm, committed individuals that will not comply. Without that, there's no movement. You can get millions of people out on the street expressing your opinion that you don't like it. They don't care about that. But if those million people out in the street, or even less, are very determined, well, they're probably going to try to march into parliament. They're probably going to, if it's clear to the establishment that these are not just people that are on, taking time off work to express their opinion, but that they're very serious about not complying. And if you can make that clear, then that's a movement. It's not going to be effective until people start resisting. And I could give all kinds of examples from history. And one of the most recent ones is Russia. The Russian people understood that the totalitarian system was just not something they were going to go along with. They ridiculed the government in private conversations constantly. They found all kinds of ways, including the black market, to circumvent everything that the government was trying to do. They resisted, and they developed the intellectually and as people and as resistors in a framework like that, rather than be like we are as Canadians.
Yeah. Canadians learn to say no. That's my closing thought. Okay. Well, thank you.
But and I reject when people say, if only we all did this. Well, as soon as someone says that, I say no. It's not about we all need to do this, or we need a critical mass. I'm not going to go there. You can do it. You do it. Each person can resist. Each person can do what they can do. That's the only thing that matters, because you do not control. You are not a society planner. You cannot control. You cannot produce propaganda that will get everyone to go out in the street and all of a sudden that'll magically change things. You can't do that. They have propaganda. They put out this environment of propaganda, but you can resist. And that's what you need to do. I think it comes back. Without that, there's nothing. So when I speak, I'm speaking to the people who are already resisting and enjoy that encouragement and enjoy that rationalization of why it's the best thing to do, or that are on the verge of possibly resisting, or they get the idea that they could personally resist. Those are the people I'm talking to. I don't want to think that we can create ideal propaganda. I mean, this show is partly to inspire those people, I think. If we intend it primarily as counter propaganda, it's not going to work. But it has an important place because it speaks to those people who are potentially those who can resist. That's how I see our role as communicators.
Yeah. I mean, at the very least, I think it's important to stand on principle and for truth and justice when it matters. And so even if the efforts are for naught in the end, it was important to do it anyways. I have to run, actually. But I just wanted to thank you so much, Cindy, for speaking with us. Such a
Thank you.
huge admirer of your work. Please, I'm looking forward to whatever you have planned next. But for everyone who'd like to learn more about Denis, we'll include his website in the show notes. Definitely go check it out. And yeah, maybe we can have you on again. We didn't get to touch on climate change too much, unfortunately, but we would love to hear more about the science on that on this show. So maybe we can have you on again. But yeah, in the meantime, good luck living in
I
Ontario.
enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much. I really enjoyed this episode. And with the climate change, what we're going to show, if we talk about it in a next episode, is the degree to which it's as insane as trying to model an epidemic on something that is completely baseless. That's where we're at with climate as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much fake stuff. Where's the truth?
Such a healthy society we live in, hey?
Yeah,
Yep.
especially
Yep.
ours in Canada. All right. Well, I'm gonna end the recording. I'm just gonna stop it now. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yes.